Michael Carter stepped onto Flight 762, his 6-foot frame moving with the ease of someone accustomed to long hours in transit. At 45, Michael, a former military investigator turned private security consultant, had seen his fair share of tense situations. But today, he was just another traveler heading home to Chicago after a lengthy assignment. Dressed in a dark gray blazer over a black turtleneck, his presence was commanding yet unassuming. He only hoped for a quiet, uneventful flight. The plane was already abuzz with activity as passengers stowed their bags and settled into their seats. Michael maneuvered past a few still-standing travelers, offering polite nods as he made his way toward seat 14F near the emergency exit. He had always preferred aisle seats, it made it easier to stretch his legs, but today, he'd take what he could get. He placed his sleek leather carry-on beneath the seat in front of him, exhaling slowly as he adjusted his seatbelt. A few rows back, Elizabeth Dane, a 52-year-old socialite with frosted blonde hair and an air of self-importance, flipped through a high-end fashion magazine. Dressed in a tailored cream-colored pantsuit and pearl earrings, she exuded wealth and privilege. Her eyes, however, were no longer focused on the glossy pages of her magazine but instead on Michael. From the moment he boarded, she had taken notice. There was something about him that unsettled her. He was too composed, too quiet, and that alone made her uneasy. Elizabeth shifted in her seat, pretending to read while sneaking glances at Michael. Her fingers drummed against the armrest, her mind racing. Who is he? Why is he sitting near the emergency exit? The fact that he wasn't doing anything outwardly suspicious only heightened her anxiety. He's trying to blend in too much. Unable to quell her unease, she raised a manicured hand as a flight attendant passed by. "Excuse me, dear," she said in a hushed voice. The young flight attendant, Sophie Grant, stopped with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am, how can I assist you?" Elizabeth leaned in slightly. "That gentleman near the emergency exit, are you sure it's safe for him to be there?" Sophie followed Elizabeth's gaze to Michael, who was now flipping through a well-worn book. Her practiced, professional expression remained unchanged. "I assure you, ma'am, all passengers on board have gone through security screening. Our seating arrangements are in full compliance with safety regulations." Elizabeth pursed her lips. "It's just, well, you can't be too careful these days. Can you?" Sophie's smile didn't falter, but her voice carried an edge of patience. "If there's anything specific that concerns you, please let us know. Our priority is making sure every passenger feels safe and comfortable." Elizabeth nodded, but Sophie's reassurance did little to ease her concerns. As the flight attendant walked away, Elizabeth turned her attention back to Michael, watching as he reached into his bag. Her stomach tensed. What's he looking for? Her thoughts spiraled as she watched his hands move deliberately. Is it a weapon? Something dangerous? But then, to her mild frustration, all he pulled out was a small prescription bottle. He checked the dosage label before tucking it back inside his bag, completely unaware of the scrutiny. Michael adjusted in his seat and resumed reading. Elizabeth, however, could not shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. Chapter 2. Seeds of Suspicion. As the plane taxied down the runway, Elizabeth's nerves tightened. Michael's presence loomed in her mind, a growing anomaly she couldn't ignore. She had always considered herself perceptive, someone who could sense danger before others did. And today, she was convinced she was the only one paying attention. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air, and once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The usual hum of a long flight filled the cabin, passengers chatting quietly, laptops clicking open, and flight attendants preparing beverage carts. Yet Elizabeth remained hyper-focused on Michael. She noticed every little movement, every time he unzipped his bag, every glance toward the window, every casual stretch of his fingers. Each action fed into her paranoia. What is he hiding? Unable to contain herself any longer, she pressed the call button. Sophie returned promptly, her expression still polite but now tinged with slight concern. "I'm sorry to bother you again," Elizabeth began, lowering her voice, "but I really think that man should be checked. He keeps looking through his bag like he's nervous about something inside it." Sophie inhaled slowly, keeping her voice level. "Ma'am, as I've mentioned, all passengers pass through security before boarding. Unless there's a clear sign of danger, we cannot inspect a passenger's belongings without cause." Elizabeth's voice grew sharper. Normal? That's what they always say, until it isn't. A few passengers turned their heads toward the exchange. Sensing the tension, Sophie remained composed, but her patience was wearing thin. I assure you, ma'am, we have everything under control. Please try to relax. Elizabeth huffed, crossing her arms. You people never take things seriously until it's too late. Sophie gave a tight-lipped smile and walked away, trying to shake off the conversation. But Elizabeth wasn't done. If the flight attendants wouldn't listen, maybe the other passengers would. She leaned toward the man beside her, a middle-aged businessman engrossed in a crossword puzzle. Excuse me, she whispered. Have you noticed the man near the exit? Doesn't he seem suspicious to you? The man glanced up, following her gaze before shrugging. I hadn't noticed anything. Elizabeth frowned. He keeps checking his bag, like he's hiding something. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry? The businessman sighed. If there was really a problem, I think the crew would handle it. Her frustration deepened. No one was taking this seriously. If no one else was going to act, then she would have to. She continued watching Michael, her heartbeat quickening every time he moved. She was convinced now, something was going to happen on this flight, and she would be the one to stop it. Chapter 3. Escalating distrust and accusations. Elizabeth sat stiffly in her seat. Her body coiled with tension as she watched Michael Carter out of the corner of her eye. Every action he took, every movement of his hand, every shift in his seat, sent a shiver of suspicion through her. Her fingers clutched the armrests of her first-class seat as she forced herself to remain calm. But how could she, when he kept checking his bag every few minutes? The way his fingers brushed against the zipper, his glances downward, the way he subtly adjusted it, she could not ignore it. It was as though he was waiting for the right moment, waiting to do something dangerous. The rest of the plane's passengers were blissfully unaware of the growing storm brewing within her. The hum of the engines, the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, and the quiet murmurs of conversations all seemed like background noise compared to the pounding of her heart. The cabin was peaceful, but to Elizabeth, that peace felt deceptive. Her breath grew shallow as she weighed her options. She couldn't just sit there and pretend everything was fine. If she was wrong, she would look foolish. But if she was right, and she did nothing, the consequences would be unthinkable. She flagged down a passing flight attendant, her fingers trembling slightly as she grabbed at the woman's uniform. Excuse me, she whispered urgently. Sophie turned with a polite smile, though her brow creased at the intensity in Elizabeth's gaze. Yes, ma'am, is everything all right? Elizabeth leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. The man sitting by the emergency exit. He keeps checking his bag, over and over. I think he's hiding something. He could be dangerous. Shouldn't someone check? Sophie glanced at Michael. He sat relaxed, one hand resting on his knee, his gaze focused on the book in his lap. Ma'am, I can assure you, all passengers on this flight have gone through security screenings. There is nothing to be worried about. Elizabeth wasn't convinced. But what if they missed something? Just because he went through security doesn't mean he isn't hiding something now. I have a bad feeling about this. Sophie's smile wavered slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. I understand your concern, ma'am. However, we cannot inspect a passenger's personal belongings without due cause. If there's anything truly alarming, please let me know. Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line as Sophie walked away, leaving her feeling unheard. How could they be so dismissive? Didn't they realize what was at stake? Her frustration burned beneath her skin, and she glanced around, hoping someone else on the flight would see what she saw. But everyone seemed uninterested, preoccupied with their books, their movies, their conversations. She was alone in this. She had to find someone who would listen. She turned to the woman beside her, a middle-aged brunette scrolling through her phone. Excuse me, Elizabeth said in a hushed tone. Have you noticed the man near the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off to you? The woman blinked at her, then followed Elizabeth's gaze. Who? Him? He looks fine to me. What's the issue? Elizabeth's frustration mounted. He keeps checking his bag like he's nervous about something inside it. That's not normal. I tried telling the flight attendant, but she won't do anything. Shouldn't we say something? The woman sighed and shrugged. I think if there was really a problem, the crew would handle it. I don't see anything suspicious. Elizabeth clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. How could they all be so blind? She turned in her seat, looking past rows of heads, searching for someone else who might listen. She spotted a well-dressed man across the aisle, a businessman in his 50s reading the Wall Street Journal. Leaning slightly toward him, she said, "Excuse me, sir, I need to ask you something." The man sitting over there, near the exit. "Have you noticed anything strange about him?" The businessman lowered his newspaper and followed her gaze before shaking his head. "No, ma'am, he's just reading a book." "What exactly are you worried about?" Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. "He's been checking his bag over and over. It's like he's making sure something is still there. I think he's planning something. We have to be careful." The businessman's eyes darkened slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Ma'am, not to be rude, but you might be overreacting. If there was any danger, the crew would have handled it." Elizabeth gritted her teeth. "That's what they always say, until it's too late." She sat back, arms folded, her heart pounding as anger and fear warred within her. If no one was going to take this seriously, then she had no choice. She would have to act. She kept her eyes locked on Michael, her breaths shallow, her fingers twitching as adrenaline surged through her veins. If he so much as reached into that bag one more time, she would make sure everyone knew. But she never expected what happened next. Michael shifted in his seat and, ever so calmly, unzipped his bag again. That was it. That was the final straw. Elizabeth shot to her feet. "You," she said loudly, pointing an accusatory finger at him. The sudden outburst caught the attention of several passengers, and a ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. Michael looked up, his expression calm but slightly surprised. "Me?" Elizabeth's voice trembled with indignation. "Yes, you. What's in that bag? I've been watching you this entire flight. You keep checking it, over and over. What are you hiding? I demand that someone searches him." Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin as heads turned toward Michael. Some passengers leaned in, curiosity piqued, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Linda, another flight attendant, rushed forward. "Ma'am, please calm down. You're disturbing the other passengers." Elizabeth's hands shook as she pointed at Michael again. "No, I won't calm down. He's hiding something dangerous, I just know it. If you won't check, I'll do it myself." Michael exhaled deeply, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Slowly, with deliberate movements, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a leather badge. He held it up for everyone to see. "Michael Carter," he said, his voice steady but firm. "U.S. Army veteran, now a private security consultant. The bag I've been checking contains my medication. I have a heart condition." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth's face drained of color as she stared at the badge. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Linda turned to her, voice clipped with irritation. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat. Now." Elizabeth's legs felt weak as she collapsed back into her chair, her entire body shaking. She had humiliated herself in front of the entire cabin. More than that, she had accused an innocent man. Michael remained calm, placing his badge back into his pocket before turning his attention back to his book, though the tension in his shoulders hinted at the frustration he must have felt. As the plane continued its journey, the cabin remained eerily silent, the weight of Elizabeth's false accusations pressing down on everyone like an invisible fog. She had assumed the worst, and now she was left with nothing but shame. And Michael, though outwardly composed, knew that this was yet another battle, a quiet, exhausting fight against the biases that still plagued the world. Chapter 4. Public confrontation and rising tension. Elizabeth could no longer contain the weight of her paranoia. The nagging fear that had been gnawing at her since takeoff exploded into action as she shoved herself out of her seat, nearly knocking over the tray of a startled passenger next to her. "You," she bellowed, her voice sharp and cracking through the hum of quiet conversation and in-flight entertainment. The plane fell into a sudden, stunned silence as heads turned toward her, eyes widening in confusion and unease. Passengers who had been lost in their books, movies, or idle chatter now focused on the unfolding spectacle. Some passengers immediately turned toward Michael Carter, the man she had been watching obsessively since they left the ground. The tension in the air was palpable, an electric charge humming beneath the surface. Michael, still seated, exhaled slowly and closed his book, setting it calmly on his lap. He had sensed Elizabeth's eyes on him for hours, her gaze drilling into his every movement. He had chosen to ignore it, hoping it would pass, but now, as the whispers grew and the ripple of concern spread through the cabin, he realized he had no choice but to address the storm she had conjured. Elizabeth pointed a trembling finger at him, her breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. "I demand that his bag be searched," she shrieked. "He's been checking it over and over. And nobody's doing anything. We're all in danger." A collective murmur of disbelief swept through the passengers. Some scoffed, shaking their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their own uncertainty now ignited by Elizabeth's hysteria. Michael remained calm, his hands resting lightly on his book. He had encountered people like Elizabeth before, people who mistook their own prejudice for intuition. His years in security and investigative work had trained him for moments like this. He knew that anything he did now could either escalate or diffuse the situation. He chose the latter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, neither defensive nor aggressive, "I assure you, there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I've simply been checking on my medication, which I need to keep with me at all times." Elizabeth's face flushed red. "Oh, please, that's just an excuse. I know what I saw. You're planning something." Before Michael could respond, Linda, the flight attendant, hurried down the aisle, her normally composed face tight with concern. "Ma'am, I need you to take your seat immediately," she said, her tone firm but measured. "You are causing a disruption." Elizabeth turned to Linda, exasperation twisting her features. "How are you not seeing this? This man is suspicious. We can't just sit here and do nothing." Linda took a deep breath. She had been trained for conflict resolution, but situations like these were always delicate. "Ma'am, I understand that you're feeling uneasy, but I must ask you to lower your voice. Mr. Carter has done nothing wrong. We cannot inspect a passenger's belongings without probable cause." The whispers among passengers grew louder. A few were shaking their heads at Elizabeth's insistence, others now eyeing her with irritation rather than concern. The murmurs weren't about Michael anymore, they were about her. Elizabeth, realizing that the crowd wasn't rallying behind her, clenched her fists. "So we're just going to sit here and ignore the signs? And when something happens, you'll all regret it." Michael inhaled deeply, then slowly reached into his pocket. "I didn't want to have to do this," he muttered under his breath. He pulled out a small, leather badge case and flipped it open, the unmistakable gold emblem glinting under the cabin lights. A hush fell over the passengers. "Michael Carter," he said, his voice even, "private security consultant, former military investigator. The reason I've been checking my bag is because I have medication that I need to take at specific times. That's all." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. The certainty she had clung to, the idea that she was the only one who had seen the danger, was unraveling before her eyes. Linda turned to Elizabeth, her patience now worn thin. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist that you take your seat and remain quiet for the rest of the flight. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, we will notify authorities upon landing." The murmurs among the passengers turned from uncertainty to outright annoyance. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Another whispered, "She should be the one getting searched." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her body trembling. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. Her paranoia, her assumptions, they had led her to publicly humiliate not only herself but an innocent man. She lowered herself into her seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Michael, meanwhile, didn't gloat, didn't react with anger, he simply picked up his book again, flipping back to his last page with a quiet sigh. As the tension slowly eased, Linda made her way toward the front of the plane, discreetly whispering to another flight attendant to keep an eye on Elizabeth for the rest of the flight. To those watching this unfold, let this be a lesson. Prejudice, unchecked fear, and baseless assumptions can cause harm. Let's not be like Elizabeth. Instead, let's stand with those who handle situations with grace, patience, and dignity. If you support justice and fairness, if you believe in standing up against wrongful accusations, show your support by liking this channel and subscribing. Your voice matters, and together, we can push back against injustice. One story at a time. Chapter 5. The truth is revealed. Michael Carter exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him like a heavy stone. The murmurs, the gasps, the judging eyes, he had endured this before. He had felt this brand of suspicion before. And now, in the confined space of Flight 762, it was happening again. He knew what he had to do. But still, the sheer exhaustion of it all settled deep in his bones. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, knowing that in this moment, every second was under scrutiny. The cabin had gone eerily silent, the passengers holding their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. With a quiet flick of his wrist, he pulled out a sleek leather case and flipped it open. The unmistakable golden gleam of his badge reflected the dim overhead light, its polished surface a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere in the cabin. "Michael Carter," he said, his voice measured, steady, private security consultant, former military investigator. "I've been checking my bag because I have heart medication inside. That's all." The silence that followed was deafening. The tension that had coiled tight in the air now felt almost suffocating as realization washed over the passengers. For hours, Elizabeth Dane had built up a case against this man, twisting ordinary gestures into something sinister, weaponizing her paranoia. And now, as she stared at that badge, at undeniable proof that she had been wrong, the color drained from her face. A single voice cut through the stillness. "Oh my God," someone muttered from a few rows back. Another passenger shook their head in disgust, while others exchanged glances of unease and regret. A man who had earlier nodded along with Elizabeth's claims now looked away, suddenly ashamed. But Elizabeth? She was still standing, still locked in place, her hands trembling at her sides. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, her brain struggling to process what was happening. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That can't be right. That's not, he's lying. That can't be real." Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to maintain his composure. It wasn't the first time someone refused to believe him, refused to accept the truth because it didn't align with their assumptions. He had faced worse, much worse. He knew better than to feed into her hysteria, knew that no amount of reasoning would be enough to reach her. So he said nothing. He simply held her gaze, allowing the silence to stretch between them, forcing her to sit with the weight of her own accusations. Elizabeth turned desperately toward Linda, the flight attendant who had been trying to de-escalate the situation for the past hour. "You had to check it. You had to check his bag. He could have forged that badge. How do we know?" "Ma'am," Linda interrupted, her voice now firm, unwavering. "That's enough." The finality in her tone seemed to break something in Elizabeth. Her face twisted, not in realization, but in indignation. She turned toward the other passengers, seeking validation, searching for someone, anyone, who still believed her. But all she found were averted gazes, people shifting in their seats, expressions laced with discomfort. Nobody was on her side anymore. She was alone in this, and she knew it. Her hands curled into fists as she sucked in a shaky breath. "You're all fools," she hissed, voice low but venomous. "You're just going to believe him? Just like that? No one is even going to question it? You're all sheep." But the passengers had made up their minds. One woman scoffed, rolling her eyes. Another man shook his head. A few whispered amongst themselves, not even trying to be discreet anymore. Michael remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. The truth had already spoken for itself. Linda, who had been nothing but patient up until now, had reached her limit. She stepped forward, her posture rigid with authority. "Ms. Dane," she said sharply, "please take your seat. This is your final warning. If you continue to cause a disruption, we will have no choice but to notify law enforcement upon landing." Elizabeth's breath hitched. Law enforcement. The words sent a sharp jolt of reality through her. Her gaze darted back to Michael. She had convinced herself he was the threat. She had believed it so fiercely, so unquestionably. But now, she was the one facing consequences. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered herself into her seat. But she didn't apologize. She didn't admit she was wrong. Instead, she turned her face toward the window. Her jaw clenched, her expression unreadable. The plane remained still in heavy silence for another long moment before passengers finally began to settle back into their seats, shifting uncomfortably, their bodies still tense from what had just transpired. Some tried to return to their books or in-flight movies. But the atmosphere had changed. The ease and comfort that had once filled the cabin were now tainted with unease. Linda exhaled, turning to Michael. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. If there's anything you need. Michael shook his head. It's fine, he said, though the exhaustion in his voice was unmistakable. I just want to get through this flight. Linda nodded solemnly before returning to her duties. As Michael picked up his book again, he felt the eyes of other passengers on him. A few, cautiously, nodded at him, silent acknowledgments of what had just happened. Others, seemingly embarrassed by their own previous suspicions, looked away. The journey continued, but the energy on that plane had shifted. And Elizabeth Dane? She sat in silence, staring blankly out the window, forced to sit with the heavy, unbearable truth she had tried so hard to ignore. For those listening, let this be a moment of reflection. Injustice often comes disguised as righteousness. False assumptions, unchecked biases, they have consequences. If you believe in standing up for the truth, if you stand against prejudice, show your support by liking this channel and subscribing. Your voice matters. Let's push back against injustice. One story at a time. Chapter 6. Consequences for Elizabeth. The plane's descent began, a slight shift in altitude pressing passengers gently against their seats. The hum of the engines, once an unnoticed backdrop to the tension, now felt ominous, like the drumroll before the final act. The passengers of Flight 762, having witnessed the unfolding drama, exchanged wary glances, some still stealing glances at Elizabeth Dane, whose rigid form was now shrouded in silence. Michael Carter, for his part, remained unreadable, his hands folded neatly over his book, his expression betraying nothing. He had seen situations like this before, not on a plane, perhaps, but in a world where men like him were too often mistaken for threats. He had learned long ago that silence could be the most powerful response. The truth had revealed itself. And now, all that remained were the consequences. A crackling voice interrupted the uneasy stillness. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our final descent into Chicago O'Hare. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and your tray tables are in the upright position. On behalf of our crew, we thank you for flying with us today. The announcement barely registered for Elizabeth, whose mind was racing faster than the plane itself. She had lost control of the narrative. The very people she had sought to protect were now staring at her as though she were the problem. The realization sent a sharp pang of resentment through her chest. They don't understand. They don't see what I see. I was only trying to help. She turned toward the window, her reflection staring back at her, a pale face, tight with indignation, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. Fear, humiliation, the ugly realization that she had pushed too far. A sudden bump jolted the plane as the landing gear deployed. The familiar pressure in her ears only added to the growing weight in her chest. She clenched her fists, steeling herself for what was coming. Then, as the wheels touched down with a heavy thud, she saw them, just beyond the terminal windows. A small group of uniformed officers stood near the gate, their faces impassive, their stance firm, her breath hitched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They weren't here for him, they were here for her. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began shifting, collecting their belongings, eager to disembark, but there was no rush for Elizabeth. She remained motionless, the walls of the aircraft suddenly feeling far too close. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Michael rose from his seat, adjusting his blazer before reaching for his bag. As he stepped into the aisle, a few passengers gave him knowing nods, silent acknowledgments, subtle gestures of respect. A woman too rose back murmured, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Another man shook his head, his gaze lingering on Elizabeth before turning back to Michael. Michael didn't respond. He simply nodded once, offering them the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the flight. He was ready to move on, even if the rest of the world wasn't. Elizabeth, however, was trapped. A flight attendant approached her seat, her voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Dane, we need you to come with us." Elizabeth's nails dug into the armrests. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong." The attendant's lips pressed together in a tight line. "Security officers are waiting to speak with you. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Elizabeth turned, looking for support, but found none. The passengers who had once entertained her paranoia now avoided her gaze. Even the businessman who had nodded along in the beginning was suddenly engrossed in his phone, unwilling to acknowledge her existence. This is absurd, she snapped, but the words came out weaker than she intended. You're all making a mistake. I was only trying to keep everyone safe. Nobody responded. The aisle gradually emptied as passengers filed out, each step toward the exit feeling like another door closing in on her. She had lost control, lost credibility, lost everything in the span of a single flight. And then, before she could protest further, 2 security officers entered the cabin. "Miss Dane?" one of them said, his voice neutral. "Please come with us." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat dry as she turned to face them. The moment stretched long and unbearable, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her. She wanted to argue, to fight, but deep down, she knew there was nothing left to say. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet. The walk down the aisle felt eternal, her shame magnified with every step past the passengers who had borne witness to her undoing. The whispers followed her, murmurs of disbelief, of relief, of judgment. As she reached the exit, she cast one last glance toward Michael Carter. He stood just beyond the terminal, his silhouette framed against the bustling airport beyond. He did not look at her. He did not need to. She had already lost. The officers guided her into the terminal, their expressions unreadable. The cold airport air hit her skin like a slap, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. And just like that, she was gone. For those of you following this story, what do you think happens next? Should Elizabeth face legal consequences for her actions? Should she be given a chance to reflect and redeem herself? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear how you think this should end. And if you believe in standing against prejudice, in supporting those who face unjust accusations, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can bring awareness to these moments and ensure that voices like Michael's are heard, respected, and never ignored again. Chapter 7. Resolution and Reflection. Michael Carter watched as Elizabeth Dane was escorted away by security. Her once commanding presence now diminished, her shoulders drawn inward as if trying to shrink from the weight of the moment. She still muttered protests, still clung to the belief that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only been trying to protect the people around her. But the world was no longer listening. The murmurs of passengers died down as they dispersed, filtering into the terminal, resuming their lives, perhaps carrying with them a story to tell their families, one about a woman who let fear and prejudice rule her actions, and a man who endured it all with dignity. The tension that had suffocated the air inside the cabin began to dissipate. But for Michael, the moment lingered. It always did. He adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder and stepped onto the cool, sterile tiles of the airport floor. The chatter of travelers, the beeping of golf carts carrying passengers, the distant announcements over the PA system, it all blurred together as he took a deep breath. Centering himself. This wasn't the first time he had been accused of something he didn't do. He had lost count of the times people had made assumptions about him based on the color of his skin, the way he carried himself, the way he moved through spaces not built with him in mind. And yet, he refused to let those moments define his day. As he walked toward baggage claim, he thought about the bystanders. Some had been complicit in Elizabeth's paranoia, nodding along in quiet agreement when she first began voicing her concerns. Others had simply remained silent, unsure of where to stand until the truth was laid bare before them. And then there were those who, when the weight of realization settled over the cabin, offered quiet nods of respect, of regret, of understanding. And that was the thing about prejudice, it was insidious, often disguised as concern, wrapped in a false sense of duty. Elizabeth hadn't thought she was racist. She had convinced herself that she was simply being cautious, responsible, but her caution had been selective. It hadn't applied to the businessman sitting across the aisle or the young couple exchanging hushed whispers. It had been aimed squarely at him, and for no reason other than the assumptions she had crafted in her mind. Michael let out a slow breath. He knew better than to dwell on it. If he allowed every moment like this to consume him, he would never find peace. He had a choice. He could let bitterness take root, or he could move forward, refusing to carry someone else's ignorance as his burden. And so, he walked. At the baggage claim, he spotted a young woman who had been on the flight. She hesitated before stepping forward. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about what happened back there. It wasn't right." Michael studied her for a moment before offering a small, Understanding nod. I appreciate that, he said simply. She hesitated again, then asked, does this kind of thing happen often? A wry smile touched the corner of Michael's lips. More than you'd think, but less than it used to. That's progress. At least. The woman nodded, her expression contemplative. Before stepping away, Michael watched as she disappeared into the crowd, wondering if she would carry this experience with her. If she would remember it the next time she saw someone being unfairly judged. Maybe she would speak up sooner. Maybe she would be one less bystander. One more voice against injustice. That was the thing about moments like these. They had the power to change people, not just the ones directly involved, but those who bore witness. Bias wasn't always loud. More often, it was a quiet whisper in the back of the mind, an assumption that went unchecked. But once confronted with the reality of its consequences, people had the choice to do better. And many did. Michael grabbed his suitcase from the conveyor belt and made his way toward the exit. The Chicago air hit him as he stepped outside, crisp and cool against his skin. A new city, another destination, another day to be lived. This moment would become just that, a moment. A reminder of the work still left to do. Of the world that was still learning. Still unlearning, but also a reminder of resilience. Of the power in choosing dignity over anger. Of walking forward, even when the world tried to push back. And now, for those of you watching, I ask you, what do you take away from this story? Have you ever been in a situation where bias or assumption clouded judgment? Have you ever caught yourself making a snap decision about someone before knowing the full picture? Moments like these are not just stories, they are real. They happen every day, and they shape the world we live in. If you believe in standing up against injustice, in seeing people for who they truly are rather than the assumptions placed upon them, then let's start a conversation. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you think, how you feel, and what lessons you're taking away from this. And if you want to hear more stories that challenge perspectives, that bring light to the realities many face, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more conversations like this to the forefront. Together, we can change narratives. Together, we can push back against bias. One story at a time.